The university also acknowledges and is grateful to the traditional owners, elders and knowledge holders of all Indigenous nations and clans who have been instrumental in our own reconciliation journey. We recognise the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original owners and custodians of the land and waterways across this Australian continent, with histories of continuous connection dating back more than 60,000 years. We also acknowledge their enduring cultural practices of caring for country. We pay respect to elders, past, present and future, and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge within the Academy. As a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students, we are privileged to work and learn every day with Indigenous colleagues and partners. And in making this acknowledgement of country, we commit to respect and respectful and responsible conduct towards all others according to the traditional laws, LORES, of this land, particularly at times of formal ceremony. And on a personal note, I add my own disappointment at the outcome of the recent referendum and my sincere hope and wish that I live long enough to see an opportunity for it to be reversed. But our session today is to look at other issues, important as those ones are. Will has written that the reason we're gathering here is in part because of global events. It's clear that amongst all the other things that are happening, the pendulum is swinging on democracy, as it tends to do. Mistrust for government is a growing problem in almost every established democracy. It played an important role in the electoral victory of Donald J. Trump. Today's discussion will consider how Australian constitutional design, particularly strengthening the role of accountability institutions such as Parliament and its independent agencies, such as anti-corruption commissions, how all that can help to ensure that Australia bucks the global trend and continues to have healthy levels of trust in government. Now, trust is a rare commodity. At a personal level, it takes you forever to build a reputation, and as we've seen, in a reckless moment, it can be lost. The same applies for governments, and we're actually seeing it, I think, in current events this very week, that would venture into commentary on current affairs, which is not what we're here to do, but I'm happy to do so afterwards if you come and tug at my sleeves. We have two experts here, and I'm going to take it as read that their CVs are known to you, and I won't go through a traditional and lengthy recital. The format is very, very simple. We'll start off with Lisa, and she'll speak for about 10 minutes, and I'll ask her a few questions, and then Will speak for about 10 minutes, and I'll ask him some questions. I'll see if I can get them talking to each other about something that's come up in common in their delivery, and then we open it to you. When we throw to you, there's really only the most simple of rules. If you could introduce yourself when you could call for the microphone, that'd be great. I'll just look for people putting their hand up. If you want to introduce yourself, it's not compulsory, but it helps. And if you can ask a question rather than recite a poem or sing a song or make a speech, if it can be a question, but a context is fine. But if you could direct your question to either Will or Lisa. If you ask both of them, that's two questions, and we get fewer people have the opportunity to ask a question. That's really all there is to it. It's very straightforward. We do have people who are watching us on the technology, so keep in mind, when you speak, you do need to wait for the microphone, otherwise they can't hear you and it's disrespectful to them. All right, without any further delay, we'll start off with Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. Your time starts now.
All right. Thank you for that lovely introduction, John. And thank you for having me along to this event. I'm going to talk a little bit about trust in Australia, and there's a particular focus on our electoral system, which to me is something very at the heart of our democracy. It's more important than it is in other settings, as a matter of fact. But like the rest of the world, there's declining political trust here in Australia. It's not really about the basic infrastructure of our democracy, it's more about the way people are behaving in everyday life. They're okay with the way things are set up, and in Australia I think they're quite well set up too. But they're very unhappy with political parties, they're very unhappy with government. But also there has been an overall decline in satisfaction with our. our democracy as well. And these are all worrying trends. Trust is strongly connected to satisfaction with democracy. In 2007, 86% of Australians were satisfied with this democracy. By 2019, it had dipped to 59%. Then it picked up 11 points in 2022 with the Albanese government. Regime change often causes a spike in faith and trust. It would have levelled off by now. We're going through a lot of the things that other advanced democracies are going through, but we have some insulating factors. We have a lot of things going for us, and I'll just go through some of them. We're a very stable system. This is partly to do with the stability of the party system and the fact that people are still allegiant to parties. They hate parties, but they actually report in surveys that they like the stability they bring. Australians tend to see their elections as free and fair. And most say they feel as though they have a say in politics. That is quite rare. So we call that political efficacy. They have quite high levels of political efficacy. Of course, these things are all declining. Important public offices here are not politicised, like the Chief of Police or the Electoral Commissioner in America, for example. Just about every office is voted on, and that creates so many perverse incentives to bad governance. We have, on that note, a highly trusted electoral administration. And the prosaic truth about a really strong democracy is that it's only as good as its bureaucracy. And things like an accurate electoral roll. Sort of boring stuff, but these are the meat and potatoes of a really strong democracy. Now, our electoral commissioners are the most trusted public servants in Australia, the most trusted. And they work hard to keep that position too. Now, we do see governments misbehaving, but we do in Australia see them trying as well. We see governments trying to introduce truth in political advertising laws, which we're seeing at the moment at the federal level. We've just seen the government introduce the new social media laws for consumers under 16. These are things that the market probably would prefer the government didn't do, but the government is doing it because it's what the people want. Governments now are looking more closely at civics education, which I think is badly needed. And this education actually is a pretty good prophylactic against loss of trust. We've just had a JSCAM submission into inquiry into civics education, which I did a big submission to. In my home state right now, South Australia, Malinauskas has just committed just over 18 million to civics teaching in school. I think that'll be helpful. We know that understanding your political system contributes to trust about it. And we see other of our public institutions misbehaving, but we also see other public institutions here really trying. We see the Privacy Commission fighting against Bunnings, which I was pretty happy about. I just wanted a wing nut, and next minute they're taking pictures of my face, and I don't enjoy that. We see the ACCC suing banks. I don't think any of them was thinking, oh, poor banks. We were very happy about that. We felt that that institution was being responsive to our concerns. And finally, we have compulsory voting. And compulsory voting is really like magic trust fairy dust that you sprinkle on your society because it gives you lower levels of actual and perceived corruption, and it gives you more responsive government. It gives you a more sophisticated and sceptical public. It gives you a more, apparently, duty-focused citizenry, which is a good thing to have. And it also prevents excessive polarisation. Through a number of ways, it pushes the median voter towards the centre, and it also takes away some of the source of polarisation, which is a lack of buy-in and inclusion, and it also contributes to social equality. So compulsory voting regimes tend to have more social equality. That's the good news. We've got a lot of things going for us, and we should work on protecting those institutions and those practices. But I want to talk about two fins in the trust water. So in my work, I tend to look at the big picture, and I'm always scanning the horizon for fins. It could be because I snorkel for a hobby. I'm always scanning the horizon when I'm snorkeling for a fin. Here are the two fins I'm seeing right now. Civic disengagement. When people are disengaged from their institutions, they stop trusting them. The least trusting citizens are disengaged, and the best way to keep citizens trusting is to connect them back up to their institutions. People are moving away from politics. And the two main trends that concern me are a decline in voter turnout, which we have here, even in a compulsory voting regime. The last federal election, it was the lowest ever, 89%. And informal voting, which is a form of abstention. It used to be that it was usually inadvertent. Now it's more likely to be deliberate. So people are deliberately abstaining. That's a problem for me. So I'm trying to work on those problems. The second problem that's bugging me is disinformation. And John, don't worry, I'm not going to bang on about, because I talked about election conspiracism at the EARN panel last week, and I'm talking about that again today, but in a different way in relation to trust. So I won't be rehearsing the same information. But I think disinformation is a great threat to trust. For the obvious reason that we're talking about lies here. We're not talking about misinformation. Disinformation is when you deliberately promulgate an inaccurate piece of information, or a lie, if you want to be really blunt. And a particularly destructive form of disinformation, because it's a double whammy of trust destruction, is election conspiracism or denialism. So all lies reduce trust, and they reduce trust not only between citizens and their governments and institutions, but social trust between people. And two, when you're accusing electoral officers of stealing votes, you're going for the jugular of the backbone of our democracy. It's so important that we trust our electoral commissioners here. You're going for the jugular of the most trusted public servants. So when I was writing this, I was thinking, if I wanted to undermine Australian democracy, where would I hit? That's where I'd go. I'd go for our electoral system. That's where we're strong. To accuse our electoral commissioners of interfering with elections is to accuse our most trusted public servants and to really undermine the stability of our country. So the AEC and the other commissions are all being accused of vote stealing, of being aligned to the Liberal Party, of rubbing out the pencil marks on the papers and so forth. Or people are just going around saying that they won't let people who haven't been vaccinated vote. All of these things seem ridiculous to you and I, but people are believing them. Now, Tom Rogers, the Australian Electoral Commissioner, doesn't believe Australians believe this stuff, and it's my intuition that they don't go for it either. But then Jeff Karp has done some studies on this, along with some colleagues, and he's found that about a quarter of Australian electors believe fraud occurs usually or always during Australian elections, while another says around a third of respondents believe that the fraud affects the election outcomes. But I can tell you right now, it doesn't. It doesn't affect election outcomes here. And the level of fraud here is minuscule to the point of basically non-existent. Finally, in the last couple of minutes, I just want to make a list of the harms to the trust environment that election conspiracy can inflict. And partly I'm talking about what happens in the US. We're following, but we may not go all the way. So what I'm seeing might just be a dolphin fin, but it might be a shark fin. So first of all, it erodes trust in election authorities, and that leads to delegitimation of the election results. That places authentic outcomes in doubt. It makes us stop trusting the procedure we use to elect our governors. This can lead to what Aristotle called political tragedy, which we saw in the United States. We've seen it in Brazil, where people become angry. The point of an election is to permit the peaceful transference of power. And when people don't believe the procedure was enacted properly, there's social instability. So it makes it look like elections can't do their job, which is to permit peaceful transference of power. And that over time delegitimises democracy as a constitutional form. It then makes it harder to run elections, especially when the denialists are starting to threaten and attack the election workers. 25% of American election workers have resigned due to threats. The FBI is running a campaign, and the poster says it's illegal to threaten or hurt election officials, as if you would need to be told. But people do need to be told. Now, when the electoral outcome isn't accepted, the authority of parliaments is eroded, and legitimate authority is seen to concentrate on the electoral loser. So they have standing. The people that actually won don't have a claim to the consent of the people. And then it becomes harder for them to govern. It also has a kind of contagion effect on our respect for other public institutions, and we see that here now. We see it in the States, but it's happening here. In particular, it erodes respect for rule of law. If the legitimacy of the legislator isn't recognised, the legitimacy of the legislator's laws isn't recognised. And you see that declining legitimacy in the sort of thing that election deniers are doing now. They're attacking election officials, they're opening fire on people that beat them out in the election race, they're breaking into facilities, this is in the United States, to check the machines for themselves. And you're thinking, oh, not in Australia. Yes, we're having it here now. We're having threats of violence against election workers. We're having election workers being followed home in their cars, videotaped, the video put on social media, and they're being named. So this makes elections harder to manage. It also depresses turnout, particularly in voluntary regimes. Why vote when you think it's a foregone outcome? Also, it raises the information costs of voting. It's too hard to know who to vote for with all this disinformation there. And finally, it leads to unnecessary and cynical electoral reforms that are really forms of voter suppression. And we have that here too. Oh, there's electoral fraud. We need to tighten up ID requirements. We need to get rid of the mail-in boxes. And this is really just a form of voter suppression. And we've had examples of that here. But look, having talked about these fins in the water, which I just hope it's a dolphin fin, but I think it's not a dolphin fin, we're still in a unique position to defend ourselves from threats to democracy, but we can't keep relying on our institutions to protect them. We need to fortify them, but they are starting to fail. What we need to do is activate the citizens to be more engaged and more virtuous. And that's me, John.
Okay, so if democracy's openness is its Achilles heel and you want to engage more, put some flesh on the bones for us, please. How do you do that? What do you do to retrofit democracy for the resilience that you recognise it needs?
Okay, well, start with civics education in schools. And I mentioned this last week. Start with making it a compulsory part of the high school curriculum. Start with making it impossible to graduate unless you can prove that you can cast a formal vote.
Okay, that's great for the next couple of generations,
Yeah.
But is there not an urgency to try and retrofit something for people who already have finished school?
Right now, I'm working on a project to find ways to reduce the informal vote. First of all, we're trying to work out why people are more likely to cast an informal vote.
Because it shits them. They don't trust the system. They don't think it serves their interests.
So a lot of this is about things that would not be in my control or your control. It's putting the onus back on politicians to be more responsive and also to be more truthful. Now, one way you can make them more truthful is you can introduce truth in political advertising laws. That will help.
You think that will restore people's faith and trust in the short term?
I think it's a good start. I think also reform around campaign finance would really help. I think if politicians attended more to the issues, this is one of the things that's really bugging Australians. They feel that politicians don't talk about or act about things that really concern them. But a lot of this is on politicians.
Okay. I'm not sure about this, but I think one of the reasons a lot of people have disconnected is because of inequality.
Well, look, if there was one thing I could do to make our democracy stronger, it wouldn't be a democratic reform, it would be the economic reform. Exactly what you say, John. I'd reduce inequality. Inequality is responsible for so many things that are wrong with democracies everywhere. But one thing we can do, though, is make sure people are equally informed. It's very hard to reduce inequality, but all the things that I talked about, the reduction in turnout, it's among the marginalised people, the less well educated. Informal voting is concentrated among marginal people and less well educated people, and also the young, who are also poorer than everybody else. So by reducing inequality, I could solve those problems immediately, but I can't. But I can help to make government more responsive, and I can work to protect compulsory voting. So build up compulsory voting, build up voting inclusion, get more people voting, get more people casting a formal vote. The more people vote, the more responsive governments are. There have been millions and millions of studies done that shows that government attention follows the votes.
So the inequality argument comes from the Nobel Prize-winning French economist Thomas Piketty, whose book lots of us bought, but almost nobody read because it's really, really complicated. And it's an economic textbook. But his message, by and large, the message is studying all the different democracies, the more flat the economy is, the stronger democracy is. The more unequal it is, the weaker it is. And the other feature of strong democracies is people sing together in choirs.
Oh, wow.
So at the time of our bicentenary, there was a study done about democracies, and it found that the strongest democracies are those that have the most choirs. Now, it's not really because people sing together, it's just because they do something together and engage with other people. It's about community. And we've become, you talked about polarisation, we've become more and more disconnected. Fewer and fewer people volunteer, fewer and fewer people know their neighbours.
People need a common purpose, don't they?
Street parties, all of that sort of stuff. All right, well...
But it just put me in mind of a country like Denmark. There's countries like that with the very even equality and high levels of education. They naturally have high turnout. They naturally join together with a common purpose.
All right. We'll come to the civics deficit maybe later on, because I'm acutely aware that Will is sitting here going, I want to have a go. So your time starts now.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so I'm going to pick it up actually on that discussion to think a little bit about the relationship between these two centres that are sponsoring this talk today, the Centre for Comparative Constitutional Studies and the Centre for Public Integrity. Why would they be unified in this project? Well, because I think one of the key ways in which we need to be thinking about this kind of rescue project for democracy in Australia is thinking about the way that our institutions operate and how responsive they are to the people. So we have what Lisa calls engaged citizens. And because in many ways, democracy is a representative project, right? The people, we can't directly govern ourselves. We have to govern through public officials and through public institutions. And it's critical that those public institutions and those public officials act in our interest. How do we do that? Well, we have hundreds of years of constitutional experience that says what you do is disperse power between institutions so that institutions can monitor and check and balance one another. That's at the very center of a government that we trust, a government that operates in our interests and that can attack the kinds of things that John's talking about, inequality, the serious challenges we face as societies in the 21st century. And some of my own work has looked at what Lisa would call a significant shark fin, I think, that we're seeing emerging around the world is a phenomenon that I call the constitutional dark arts, which can be summarized essentially as centralization of political power in one institution. We're seeing that at the state level here in Victoria. We're seeing it at the Commonwealth level. We're seeing it all around the world. We're seeing it, obviously, very likely in the United States under Donald J. Trump in the coming years. And this centralization is being justified in two different ways. One is this kind of populist argument, right, that the elected leader is the representative of the individual or of the people. So there's kind of a carrying out the will of the people. And the second one comes from public management theory and this idea that private forms of kind of centralization are actually more effective and efficient. And what I want to say and argue is actually neither of these arguments are actually at all persuasive. That centralization of power in an elected leader is neither democratic nor efficient. And just to give some examples in the Australia context, we have seen at both the the Commonwealth and at the state level, the centralization of authority in the office of the elected leader, whether it's the Premier or the Prime Minister. Obviously, we'll all remember when the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, appointed himself secretly to a number of different portfolios. This was obviously in significant violation of checks and balances, in particular the idea of responsible government, because in this case, Parliament could not hold him account for what was happening in those portfolios because they didn't know. Significant problem. We also see at the state level, just here in Victoria, just one example, an expansion of the Premier's personal office significantly, and in that case has been justified as being a more democratic kind of system in where the elected leader can carry out and get things done. Right. What are the consequences of this that we've seen in the Australian context? One is an erosion of the role of Parliament. Right. Parliament has, in many cases, become dependent on the executive, and of course that's meant to be the other way around. Just one example we could see just about 10 days or 2 weeks ago, we had a guillotine motion in the Senate where over 40 bills went through the upper house of the Parliament without serious discussion or scrutiny, introduced by the government. And we've seen in recent years a Centre for Public Integrity report showing that within the last 2 years, compliance rates with legitimate requests for documents from the upper house of the Senate in the Commonwealth have actually halved from 48% to 20%. So as Parliament has receded, secrecy and lack of transparency has increased. Now, what is that going to do? Well, that obviously is going to lead to an erosion of trust, the kind of statistics that we've heard Lisa talk about. And it also leads to, I think, undermines efficiency and actually leads to poor governance. And the classic example of this would be the robo-debt scheme that we saw from 2016 to 2019, when an unlawful program was essentially an unlawful debt collection program that generated inaccurate Centrelink debts, existed for 3 years. And numerous public servants clearly were trying to avoid giving advice or giving poor advice or not frank and fearless advice on this, because at least of what the National Anti-Corruption Commission thought, because they thought they were appealing to or trying to follow the perceived will of the government. Now that should be something that is of concern to us, as we see even the public servants in Canberra and also across at the state levels trying to respond to the power in the centre. So it's this kind of vicious loop of centralization, undemocratic forms of action, and eroding trust. Now, what's the answer? Well, I, like Lisa, think the Australian system has some real advantages here, and one of those is the Anti-Corruption Commission. They've existed at the state level for over 30 years. Obviously, the first one was created in New South Wales in 1988, and they are unique in the Australian context. Generally, when we think of anti-corruption oversight in, say, Hong Kong or in the United States or in other places, it's often seen as crime commissions, souped-up crime commissions. Let's get the bad apples. Let's get the kind of big briefcase of cash. That's not the way it works in Australia, interestingly. In Australia, our anti-corruption institutions are actually looking for what are breaches of the public trust, right? A really interesting oversight and reporting back to Parliament and the people on what they see as breaches of the public trust. And that can include and should include all kinds of forms of corruption. They're what are called grey corruption, that are not actually unlawful, but are actually themselves violations of the public trust, when a public servant might be acting lawfully but unethically or in their own partisan or personal interest. And in that way, what we can think of then is these institutions like anti-corruption agencies as a kind of adaptation that we really need to embrace, a constitutional adaptation as Parliament is increasingly losing its role as a key accountability institution that can hold the public sector and public officials and ministers into account. We see another institution emerge, and it's one that we really need, I think, in this current climate to nurture. And the debate that we're currently seeing, and we can talk about this, and maybe John wants to ask you a question on this, about the NAC and the National Anti-Corruption Commission is, I think, very much an example of this, and how important this is, and the level of public concern about the failure of the National Anti-Corruption Commission to investigate robo-debt, I think, is a very significant debate for our democracy and for accountability in general.
So allow me a Joe Rogan moment. What if nobody cares? What if we care? People of our mindset at our legal pointy end of the discussion care, but nobody else does.
I think people do care. So just give you one statistic. The Inspector General of the National Anti-Corruption Commission received over 900 complaints from the general public over the failure to investigate Robodebt.
It's not many.
That's a lot of people to write in formally and actually make a request. I think that, we look at the last federal election. A significant number of people voted for Labor or for the Teals on the basis of integrity. And Lisa mentioned that there was a bump up in trust with the Albanese Labor election. It could be because that was an integrity election. So I do think that this matters to voters, that we have electoral evidence of that, and we have evidence of that with the level of interest and I think outrage over the Robodebt scheme and its lack of investigation. So I think there's good evidence suggesting that people do care, that this is not just an academic concern. But what our role is to think about how we can design systems to respond to this, because people want their officials to act in the public interest.
And can I just mention?
I'll come to you in a moment. I've still got some loose threads I want to tease, and then we'll get you talking to each other. Just hold that thought. You talked about the erosion of the role of Parliament. Mm. Have you been to watch Parliament lately, federal or state? It's hard to respect the institution when it is so debased in its daily practices. Mm. I went to watch Victorian State Parliament Question Time not long ago. The Speaker, everyone knows who the Speaker is? Everybody? Anybody? Marie Edwards. 5 times. There will be no more warnings. You've disciplined kids. You say to them, I'm not going to give you another warning. 5 times she said, I will not give another warning. 5 times. It was utterly ineffectual. It was hilarious. It wasn't even chaotic. It was pandemonium. You couldn't hear what was being said. They were shouting at each other. It was absolutely appalling. It's hard even for someone who is as invested in the structures and the ideas and the concepts and the values as I am. It was very hard to walk away thinking everything's in good hands in there. Aren't they doing a fabulous job? I can relax. Our elected political leaders are doing a fabulous job. Not.
So I think sometimes, there's one response is that you were looking at this as the lower house you were watching?
It was, yeah. And federal Parliament Question Time is the same. It's just a joke.
I think you can see and I have seen and watched quite good discussion in the upper house, so in the Legislative Council here in Victoria, and also in the Senate, and which is one of the reasons why I think the guillotine motion was, I think, quite concerning in the Senate, which we just saw recently in the last 2 weeks. And I caution against a view of Parliament as being, kind of a circus or being, not actually being effective. And what we might need to do is figure out how to get a speaker who may be a nonpartisan speaker, who commands more authority, who's not discredited in the eyes of the opposition, which we've seen in both sides of Parliament, and different ways in which we can reinvigorate the role of Parliament. But I do think what we see, what you saw in Parliament is actually a consequence or a symptom of the way in which Parliament has been treated by successive governments, whether coalition or Labor.
And let's go back a step, and then I'll bring Lisa into this. Doesn't not come down to who gets into Parliament in the first place. There's a fair proportion of our elected representatives, federal and state, left, right, whatever else. Some of them can't read and write, let alone speak coherently and put a sentence together, let alone follow some of the complex issues they're being asked to deal with. You've got people dealing with AI who don't know how to use a computer. Now, how are we going to get decent laws on AI when half the Parliament doesn't know how to use a laptop?
Yeah, look, I don't think parliamentarians themselves need to have actual full expertise across all the specific issues. That's why we have law reform commissions and we have other forms of expertise. But what they should have is a connection to their constituents and an ability to understand what the public, what their constituents want in terms of legislation. And that's something I think we can see happening in parliaments. But I do think it requires us to think about Parliament more and about actually what role and importance it can play.
All right. Lisa, are we complacent about our democracy?
Australians are quite complacent about it because they've had it's so good for so long. By the same token, when you survey them against other people in other established democracies, they are more likely to say it's your duty to vote than anyone else. They are more likely to say you must pay your taxes. And the other thing I find hilarious is that they feel more strongly that you should obey the law. Now, my colleagues, other colleagues in electoral studies think that this means Australians are more authoritarian. And I think, have you ever met an Australian? No, they're not authoritarian. I think Australians feel they've signed the social contract because unlike people everywhere else, most of us actually voted. And so I think they feel a bit more invested in the laws. And as for not caring, going back to this point about do Australians care, first of all, say if they didn't care so much, you can invite a citizenry to care. You can say to them, how would you feel about truth in political advertising laws? They might go, I didn't know we could do that. Yes, we can do it. Would you like them? Then 90% will say, I would love that. They do care. They want things like that. Here's another example related to the robo-debt example. And it's about corruption. In 2012, our corruption ranking was really good. We were 7th in the world.
If I remember correctly, the gap between 1 and 7 was almost nothing anyway.
Exactly.
We
were doing really well.
Yep.
And then in 2021, it fell. So we had a score of 85, then we fell to the 18th place with a score of 73. And what do you think that was about? That was about sports rules. And what I thought was very interesting about that is what made the government think that people wouldn't notice, especially because it's sport. Australians are going to notice this one. What I also found interesting about it was that they understood it as corruption in the Aristotelian sense. The pork barrelling was corruption, and the government themselves might not have even thought they were doing anything corrupt, but they were doing something corrupt, and Australians noticed and they didn't like it. So Australians can be confounding and confusing. They seem to be just interested in relaxing and having a good time, but they can really surprise you as well with their civic virtue, and they're noticing what's happening in politics.
Just coming on, just briefly on that.
And also, Will, can you maybe you have an answer. I asked Lisa before about what you do to retrofit civics, given that it will take a generation to get school children up to speed if the idea of that happening, in fact, is implemented. But if you've got any ideas about retrofitting it too.
So retrofitting the
civics,
way...
I mean, for people who are already finished school and are out in life and have missed out on finding out how the system works.
Well, I mean, one thing to get out there, which I think Lisa points to, and if we talk about pork barreling, is a very good example, or jobs for mates. All of these are examples of actions that governments take that are actually lawful, right? They are lawful, but it's very clear that people are uncomfortable with them, right? The idea that you would be using the public funds to target marginal constituencies to ensure that you win the election, that's misuse of public funds. Now, do we want to make everything illegal? Probably not. So what we should do is instead say that this is corrupt conduct. Anti-Corruption Commission should be able to investigate it, call it out, and to try to change the culture. I think if we're thinking about a kind of a civics education for Australians, it's to understand, I think, that that how much power increasingly is being exercised in the office of the Treasury, within the executive branch, and how un-Australian that is, from a point of view of thinking, if we have a system of government that is actually that is basically parliamentarian, if Parliament is losing this ability, we need to think of ways to bring that back. And I think once people understand the specific examples of where they see this going wrong, they're gonna be interested in changing it.
Can I throw back the complacency line again? We're meeting in a law school in a city that has had, in my view, what is the single greatest crisis in its criminal justice administration in the history of this country since white settlement. And we had a Royal Commission into Nicola Gobbo's manipulation of the criminal justice system to try and end a gangland war, which just last week was referenced by our highest courts as having, well, a Supreme Court judge brought down from interstate because nobody in the Victorian judicial system could be trusted to be sufficiently impartial to hear the matter. And she was scathing, Liz Fullerton, in describing yet again what the High Court has been scathing about and what a Royal Commissioner from Queensland was scathing about. And no one's been charged. Not one person from the police, from the prosecutorial forces, from the entire criminal justice system, not one person has been held to account. Do you think the public haven't noticed? Of course they have.
Yeah, I think it's a crisis of accountability, and
Totally.
and the question then becomes, what type of accountability are we? Do we want to actually put people behind bars for this? Perhaps some people, but other people who were involved in this, call them out through a process of a corrupt conduct finding, that they breached the public trust. The public servants who were involved in this in the office, in the police, or the minister, for whoever. I mean, these types of, I think we need to be having a real discussion about accountability, and that accountability discussion is critical to the way in which this government operates, whether it's at the state or federal level, whether it's going to operate efficiently, and whether people trust what it's doing, whether I think people trust that it's operating in the public interest.
I don't know if it's true or urban myth. Maybe someone in the room knows, but it's widely believed that Nicola Gobbo, when she was a student in this law school, won the prize for ethics. Does anyone know if it's urban myth or actual fact? We should check the records, actually. I don't know if someone will have them somewhere. Going back, though, let's talk about one of the biggest changes that the future holds. Social media and artificial intelligence. AI is going to transform commerce, it's going to transform political advertising, it's going to transform so many areas of interactivity between the community and the people who run it. What are the risks and challenges, or are they opportunities, Lisa, that you think it poses for those things under scrutiny in this forum today?
Well, to me, the number one threat is the capacity to exponentially disseminate disinformation. That is my number one fear. And
to generate more of it?
Generate more of it. And then the problem for me that I'm trying to think about is how to regulate that. And it's quite hard when the company's offshore, when it's owned by someone very, very powerful, and who has an interest in letting that happen as well. So to me, I'm actually quite fearful about it.
So we had a forum on, we were looking at the Middle East, and we were looking at the role of international organisations, and we ended up talking about war crimes. And there was a concept that I was not familiar with, but the international lawyers here introduced it, and I think it's brilliant, which is, where is the human in the loop? So if it's a drone that's controlled by AI that drops a bomb on a car and kills an aid worker, where is the human in the loop where you can make someone accountable rather than saying, oh, it was a drone, or oh, it was AI? Because drones and AI only do what they're told. Don't we have to adapt that? If we're looking at AI and political disinformation, and we're looking at truth in advertising, where's the human in the loop?
Well, a lot of the time, you can't find the human. That's the trouble. You can't find the human in the loop. With the drone, you know who pressed the button, who issued the command, who wrote the software. But with a lot of disinformation, you don't know a lot of the time where that's coming. So,
Yeah, please.
Robodebt itself, right, was a algorithm that was created, that was calculating the Centrelink debts, and of course the humans were on the other side of it, and they were the ones being the vulnerable individuals who were being victimized by this, essentially by this faceless algorithm that was coming up with some sort of estimate that would then ultimately help slim down government and ensure a budget, kind of balanced budget or whatever. So, it is a serious threat to accountability, to the idea that there is an individual somewhere who is responsible for this decision and that will be held accountable for it. So I think it's a further challenge to this emerging accountability crisis that we're in, that needs to be, because if we don't find ways of holding public officials accountable for the exercise of public power, we will see disengagement, lack of trust, and, as Lisa was talking about, essentially a serious threat to the legitimacy of our public authority.
Aren't we there already? You don't know what to believe anymore?
I don't think we're there yet. I think if we look across to the United States, we might see something that where they're headed in that direction, where they're much closer to that, I think. And obviously with elections and the kinds of things that are happening around that.
Well, huge proportions of the world have voted this year. India, obviously the US, we've got a crisis now in France and Germany, and they're going to go back to elections. The UK had an election. I mean, this is, we're early next year. We're not going to be immune, are we? I think it would be very naive to think that we're not going to be part of this wave.
But we have institutions, I think, that still can hold the line. The Electoral Commission is the ones that exist. The Australian one and the state level ones are doing a good job, and hopefully others will step up as well, because we have a form of constitutional democracy that is institutionally based, right? We don't have a Bill of Rights. We don't rely heavily on courts to provide accountability. We do it through institutions, and that's really significant.
And the Parliament is arguably more responsive than it is in other places, because the Parliament knows everyone's going to vote this time. It can't game it. It can't do voter suppression in battleground states. It can't do all kinds of manipulation. Everyone's going to vote, and the person who's running the election is not going to be an election denier. So in America, because those positions they're elected positions, you have election denialists running for the office of electoral commissioner. Well, it's called Secretary of State there. 300 election denialists ran in the last round of elections to be the electoral commissioner. It was quite amazing, and it was all on party lines. Then in the United States, you will have 51% of people saying, whoever is declared the winner, I don't necessarily recognise that they are the winner. I don't necessarily believe that they are the winner. We're nowhere near that. And one of the reasons is compulsory voting. Now, it's only a correlate, but we know that people in compulsory voting regimes, the electorate is more sophisticated. They're just a little bit more attentive, because they know they have to vote. They kind of, their ears prick up if they hear something. And so I think they're a little more sceptical. Plus, as Will says, we've got these very trusted election officials, and believe me, I do projects with them. Their infuriating determination to be impartial every time. Let's try and experiment. Why don't we? No, everything's a no, because they have to preserve their image and they have to be completely impartial. When I'm doing a survey, the wording is, the negotiation's incredible, but I find it incredibly reassuring at the same time, the lengths they go to preserve their impartiality and their independence. And that's something, if we can just hold the line there, we're in a strong position, or stronger than a lot of other settings.
Okay, I've just got one more question, then I'm going to call for your contributions from the floor. Just give me a wave and I'll keep a running list of people who put their hands up. Anti-corruption commissions. Are we not already seeing the chip away erosion of the original promises, both at state and federal level? Are we not seeing a sort of, it's the old Jon Faine thing, it's only a government and it's the former Premier in Victoria who brought in freedom of information. So it's the sort of thing a Premier will only do when they're first elected and then never again, and will regret it from the moment onwards. And I think that's almost looking as if we're going that way now, do you think?
I think it's a challenging time for anti-corruption commissions. I mean, if we look what happened in South Australia's anti-corruption commission was significantly stripped of significant powers in 2021. While we're all waiting for vaccines, we've seen obviously how the National Anti-Corruption Commission has operated. I think there's some challenges there.
What do you think they are?
I think that a leadership that is not fully understanding the distinctive role that anti-corruption commissions play and the critical way in which they kind of need to be thinking about breaches of the public trust.
Do you think they appointed the wrong person?
I think if we listen to Commissioner Brereton and Deputy Commissioner Rose speak about the decision on NAC recently when they were speaking to the committee, there was, the way they talked about it is, at least Commissioner Rose, who made the final decision, said, well, there was going to be no sanction, so we weren't going to take it on. Well, of course, the anti-corruption commissions don't have the power to give sanctions, so it's a very strange argument in and of itself. But I think it suggests we need to do a better job, and hopefully, the hope would be that the Anti-Corruption Commission becomes like the Electoral Commission. It becomes an inviolable part, and we understand its role, and it has this kind of sacrosanct role. But I think we're still fighting and contesting what these institutions should do, and I think that's kind of there's a really important project there to educate.
But people need to feel that those commissions are for them, defending them against public entities that are not representing their interests. They play a tremendously important role. A trusting society is so important in a million different ways. It affects our ability to walk around. It affects our ability to do something nice for somebody else. It affects our ability not to be frightened when someone comes up to us in the street, but to greet them in a friendly way because they might need help, or to render assistance to another person. And they play such a crucial role in bringing this kind of magical fairy dust for stability and eudaimonia into our lives. And when they're not doing it properly, it's kind of a disgrace, really.
And back to the comment from the Deputy Commissioner, it completely ignored the deterrent effect that an anti-corruption inquiry would have had. Mm. And I mean, it's a long, long time ago when I did crime and punishment in first year law school. Yep. But it was always not about, it was about punishment and deterrence. And they just ignored it. Nobody went, but what about? And it was very, very troubling, I thought. Who wants to ask a question? Someone? I feel like an auctioneer on Saturday afternoon. I've got two hands. Let's get a microphone. I've got three. Let's get a microphone here to the gentleman, and then we'll come to you, ma'am, and then over to you. Thank you, in the yellow jumper.
Just a quick question. I'm wondering if there are any factors which make the Electoral Commission accountable or feel accountable that aren't shared by other government departments, because I don't feel that other government departments have that same level of enthusiasm about doing the right thing.
Who are they accountable for? Is that your question too?
What mechanism makes them accountable and behave in a way that's different to, say, the Robo people and other government departments that are not doing the right thing?
What is it about the Electoral Commission that makes them behave?
Well, first of all, they're not allowed to be a member of a political party. And once we were appointing, I was doing a project with them when we were appointing a PhD, and on the job committee they started saying, are you a member of a political party? And I go, hey, you can't say that. And they said, well, we have to ask that. None of us here can be members of political parties. And I thought it was funny that they were exempt from the legislation to ask every employee that question. Second, they're accountable to the minister. They are strictly accountable for every single thing they do. They have to report to JSCEMS as well. So, and if they make a mistake, they're accountable. They resign. They have to resign. Even when it wasn't personally their fault. If someone loses a ballot paper somewhere in the electorate they're responsible for, they have to resign. So they're very skittish. And they also know they're under stronger scrutiny by the public as well. The public hold them to much greater standards than other public entities because they trust them. And I have to say they're trustworthy.
Just picking up on one of the parts of your answer, a tiny part of it, but we've sort of overlooked it. A word or two about the role of the media in holding power to account. It's the great kind of bumper sticker slogan that idealistic journalists always say is their great strength, but is it actually happening? Is it working well enough for you?
I mean, is it working well enough for you? No, I don't think it's working well enough for any of us. And then we see these lone entities at the public broadcasters constantly under attack. Why are we wasting taxpayers' money on these public entities? Because they're the only ones with the charter to tell the truth. That is their job. So, so I am very worried about the state of journalism now, and I'm very worried about standards. We need more institutions for to protect truth.
And better freedom of information laws, right, so that the media can get access to information, better whistleblower protections.
Yeah.
Secrecy, you know, we had Attorney General Mark Dreyfus did a report recently that suggested all the problems with respect to the laws and how secrecy is a serious impediment to public interest journalism, and also the defamation laws are too broad and make it very difficult for public interest journalism.
And public interest journalists have enemies that don't want them to be there.
No. Misunderstood. Kerry Stokes is a lovely man just because he's funding litigation against the media while he is a media baron.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with it at all. In the middle there. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm Barbara Bock, and I'm here as a member of ART, and I'm also here as a person who's a futurist and interested in participatory futures creation by more people. And my question is to Lisa, and I'm interested in what do you think of the creation of spaces where people are engaged in decisions that affect us all, and that is, for example, citizens' assemblies and things like that have been tried out before. What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, citizen juries, citizen assemblies, that sort of thing. I think they're a great idea. People that are participating in those sort of things will tend to be people with time, energy, education, already privilege. I love the idea in theory. In practice, to me, the most efficient way of being connected to your system is to vote and to cast a formal vote. So, and those things can all be icing on the cake. And actually, the public really likes the idea of citizen assemblies and juries, but then when you get them when you try and engage them, they don't have time. But that's a very popular idea with the public. They think there should be more public input into decisions. So any way we can do that is great. But to me, we're in a society where people are so time poor that the most we can expect of them, in some cultures they're too time poor to even vote, but we can get them to vote and to vote formally. But of course, I think we all like the idea of citizen juries, as long as we can be assured that they're representative of the population in general.
Can I tie Barbara's question to something you just touched on briefly before, which is the duopoly that we have in our two major party system, which seems to be breaking down? Do you think the rise of more and more voices of, or teals, or independents in the parliament, where we could in fact have a considerable crossbench, if the polling currently being released is accurate, would that make a difference? Because the independents engage in what they say are, well, the teal independents and voices of people say they engage in a perpetual conversation with their electorates.
I agree that the diversity now that we're seeing and the breakdown of the two-party system is creating real opportunities and creating more pluralism, and people like to see it. They want different kinds of views being represented in the parliaments. They're sick of the two-party stranglehold. One thing we've got going for us here is that we don't have a first-past-the-post system. So how can Britain and the US, for example, ever break out of that? But here we can break out of it, and the public like it. And I personally like to see that diversity of opinion, especially when you see it in the Senate, and all the compromise and all the negotiating that has to take place. I think it's productive.
And we're seeing, Will, some of those crossbenchers, also in the Senate, David Pocock and others, are making demands for the roll call of reform that you rattled off before.
Yeah, that's right.
Are you optimistic about that?
Yeah, I think the crossbench independents and the smaller parties are the natural constituency for integrity oversight reform, and we see that in the work we do at the Centre for Public Integrity every day. That those are the institute, and that also is a way that we can understand how could Parliament actually hold the executive to account when the executive controls the lower house? Well, the upper house is the institution to do that, and that is a very unique and I think again a real natural advantage that we need to take advantage of, and to think not as the upper house as being unrepresentative swill as it has been described, but as actually as a real resource. And particularly now, as trust is dropping, maybe there's going to be a resource, a kind of a valve, kind of to release some pressure on the system to ensure better forms of integrity.
And Australians like it too.
Yep, thank you. Yep.
Oh, hi, I'm Harriet. I work with Manifera and we are democracy funders, including funding CPI. You started off, Lisa, by sharing lots of fantastic things about our democracy and then talked about one of the greatest problems being people's mistrust with our democratic institutions. And I guess I wondered and disinformation, and I guess I wondered whether maybe a strategy to address that could be that democracy has a brand problem in this country, because research is showing that the more that we talk about how damaged or broken our democracy is or our democratic institutions are, the less people are trusting of them. So I felt very optimistic for the first part of your talk. So I just wondered, should we be marketing our democracy differently?
How would you do that, given you work in this space? Take us.
I'd fund the organisations to run the campaigns, but and I'll direct the question to Will. Does democracy have a brand problem?
Well, I mean, look, I think we should be in Australia, from a comparative point of view, Australia, I think, actually has a lot of lessons for the world, and we should be very positive about the way that Australia approaches, whether it's compulsory voting, whether it's the elected upper house, which is elected according to proportional representation, so you get a much broader, more inclusive set of representatives. Whether it's the institutional experimentation, right, that we have had throughout since the mid 1850s, from the secret ballot all the way to these anti-corruption commissions that are really distinct and unusual, and you go around the world talking to people about them. That's really interesting. So I do think we potentially have I think we have a brand problem. We should be talking more about this and trying to also really understand where this treasure is and to try to build it up to ensure that it doesn't, because it's I think to some extent under threat from the forces of centralization and kind of other ways in which the system is disengaging individuals from what is, and Australia has had a tradition of engaged, active citizens and active public power.
I suppose if you go back a bit, I mean, look at the collapse of the Bjelke-Petersen government in Queensland, which led to a great kind of reckoning, a time of reckoning about democracy in Australia. You get these crises. It's almost like every now and again you've got to purge the system. Is that what it's like?
Well, I think that was the period when you had in Queensland the Fitzgerald inquiry, you had in WA the WA Inc. Royal Commission, and in New South Wales the creation of ICAC, all at the same time, late 80s, early 90s, this kind of moment in integrity oversight, which I think we need to recapture that sense as we face these threats now.
We also had, and I've got this at home framed on the wall, the front page of the Financial Review one day, which was Alan Bond in the back of a police van, George Herskew being taken away in handcuffs, and Laurie Connell under arrest. That was the whole front page of the Financial Review. And every now and again, you get these moments, and the impact that has, the ripple effect that has, as people go in these big buildings that are at the back behind you all that you can't see, but I can. The effect that has on people around the boardrooms when they're seeing their friends going to jail is phenomenal. And we haven't been doing it for a while. Not because they're not committing crimes, they're just not getting caught. Another question.
Good afternoon. My name is Tyson Holloway-Clark. I'm a lecturer at the Indigenous Law and Justice Hub here at the Law School, and this is great. This is a fantastic discussion that I think is not only really timely but really important that we have within these institutions. I actually wanted to ask about accountability, and so this segues really well about practically what we think that looks like, and I'll direct this to Will, because what we see in the States with the pardoning of Hunter Biden, people have their own political opinions of that, whether he's getting off scot-free or whether he's already had his hearing. What I think people are really concerned about is the violence of the state and thinking about the fairness about how in which that violence is dispersed. And when we talk about whether people should go to jail, what the consequences are, that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about a form of political violence, and how we mitigate that and manage that is really important for our democracy, about establishing our expectations and part of the social contract. So I'd want to drill down a little bit, acknowledging, political violence is very different in Russia, it's very different in America. What is real accountability that takes into consideration the blood that some people really want, especially around robo-debt, around mining resources and allocation in this country, the involvement of corporations as well in this, like Gina Reinhardt is a name that hasn't been mentioned thus yet, but I think ought to in context of The Voice and what happened there politically and with the media. I wanted to drill down on that and what accountability really needs to be.
So, do we have an expert on Russia here? Oh, yes, we do. Will's an expert on Russia.
Right.
Handy, very handy.
So I mean, the one thing to say about Russia is Russia's an extremely extreme version of a centralized system, right? And of course, in that kind of system, you see vast levels of corruption, the point where, and of course, a system that is also so entrenched that there's unable for the people to actually hold elections don't matter, and so forth. So it's obviously the United States is a long way away from that. We're a long way from that. But thinking about accountability, just two things very briefly to say is there are different ways in which we can think about accountability, right? So we can think of forms of legal accountability where we lock people up, but also forms of political accountability. And I think, that's a discussion we need to have more, and to think, okay, that when a report is issued, for instance, by the Victorian Ombudsman, Deborah Glass is here, that calls out certain types of actions, that's not necessarily criminal, but it's like, this is really, really bad. This is a form of political accountability that we should take seriously, and that our politicians should take seriously, and that we as the public should take seriously. And I think if we're going to think about retrofitting civics, it's saying that there are different aspects of accountability, but once we see those forms of accountability emerge, it will have ripple effects, and it will change a culture, I think, that we see emerging, at least in many parts of the public service and in public officials, elected officials, which is one of a sense of impunity, or of kind of a protection racket kind of idea. And I think we need to and that's one of the roles that I think Anti-Corruption Commission can and should play, upper house oversight should play in breaking that up and saying, look, this is not acceptable, this is not acting in the public interest, and it should change.
There's nothing new, is there, about people with vast wealth using it to try to influence the outcome of democratic elections in order to serve their interests. It's happened for as long as there's been democracy. I mean, Clive Palmer spent $150 million at the last election, whether you're looking at England or France, or you can look at Italy. Look at Berlusconi. I mean, it's not new and it's not unique to us, is it, Lisa?
No, it's not unique to us. But is there a question in there?
What do we do about it if we're seeing it create distortions now? What do we do?
Yeah, well, of course, we prosecute it or we call it out. But in terms of penalties, I like the idea of disqualification from public office, because you can have a fine, say with the TIPA laws I'm interested in, truth and political advertising laws, you can impose a penalty, but then I'm thinking the parties will just raise more money to absorb that. But what really hurts is disqualification from public office. It's a reputational disqualification. For example, for politicians, that could easily be put into the Federal Electoral Act, because we already disqualify them for other reasons, for other kinds of misbehaviour. So, I think that making these public examples and making it embarrassing, and also making it clear that you're not fit, actually, to be performing these roles is the right way forward, where criminal penalties are inappropriate anyway.
Public shaming.
The public shaming, and it doesn't even have to involve a lot of shame, but it does have to involve a lot of disqualification. That's it. You can't. But we see these people in a churn. They move from ruining one institution, they move on to another institution. You think, how did this guy get another job? The talent pool must be very small, or the talent pool of people that they are willfully useless and obviously wanted is small. I'm not quite sure what the dynamic is there, but I like the idea of disqualification.
Bring back the stocks.
Well, no, you like that.
I wouldn't mind it for some particular circumstances, but yeah. Can I invite you both to make a closing comment? We're out of time, and we've promised people that they'll be able to get away at a particular time. We have to honour that. Will, some closing remarks, and if you had the magic wand, what would you do with it?
Well, I mean, to go to Lisa's idea of, magic fairy dust, I mean, I do think, the point that, I strongly sense is that, like, from a comparative point of view, the Australian situation has a lot of advantages, but it's important for us to stress those advantages and to really use those advantages in how we manage our democracy now as we head into the next 5 to 10 years. And that includes these institutions that we need to really think more about and talk more about, whether they're electoral institutions, anti-corruption commissions, and so forth. And these are not elected institutions, right? They are unelected institutions, but they are critical to our democracy. And how do they do that? Because they play this role in ensuring trust, whether it's the integrity of the electoral process or the integrity of public administration, the spending of money, the decision-making process, the procedures that the public officials take, and injecting that level of accountability back into our governance and thinking about how it actually happens institutionally, I think, is a really important agenda for us to be thinking about as we go forward into these shark-infested waters.
Yeah. I tend to agree. In terms of the retrofitting, if you can get public institutions to start working better, just because the National Corruption Agency has taken a hit from its first round, doesn't mean it can't be rehabilitated.
Right.
It can. We can rehabilitate our institutions. For the future, I am quite worried that the youth electorate's shrinking anyway naturally, and then they're shrinking themselves. But all of a sudden, fate has thrown us a bone. We've got their attention because they're not allowed to be on their phones. They're not allowed to be on social media. We can actually get the attention of the young and to get them to see the value of being civically engaged. And I think we can if we show them the dots that you can join between your economic and social welfare and being civically engaged. It's a pretty simple lesson, but it's just a few graphs. But if you can get people interested in their democracy and show them that's to their economic benefit, then I think we've got a fighting chance here.
One of the great opportunities, one of the great gigs I got when I got finally to sever the ties to the studio at the ABC, where I'd worked for 30 years and 23 of them on that morning show, I was asked to go to Port Moresby for the opening of the business year for the Chamber of Commerce, where traditionally the Prime Minister makes a speech, and they said, instead of him making a speech, we want you to interview him in front of everybody, and you have to ask him about corruption. He's promised to bring in an anti-corruption commission. You have to ask him when he's going to do it and if he'll do it this year. So this is just before COVID. And I duly flew up to Port Moresby and immersed myself in a lot of research about what was going on, and finally got James Marape up on the stage, and he then, instead of speaking for 10 minutes and being interviewed for half an hour, he spoke for half an hour, leaving 10 minutes for an interview. Very shrewd. So my first question was about the Anti-Corruption Commission. You've made this promise. What's motivating you and when are you going to do it? And he said, the motivation, it's easy. I want my children to be proud of their name. And I just looked at him and I thought, no Australian politician would ever give that answer. It is unthinkable. Now, Papua New Guinea has all sorts of issues. Let's not pretend it doesn't. But he then did go and create an anti-corruption commission. It is now caught up in scandal, but that's not his doing. It's something else. But they did do it, and they had one before we did. It's a fascinating issue. It's one that we've really canvassed, I think, in a very broad sweep today, and it shows what can happen when the Centre for Comparative Constitutional Studies and the Centre for Public Integrity here at the University of Melbourne and the Law School get together, and we're all the beneficiaries of that. Could you please thank Will and Lisa? It's been absolutely fabulous. And could you thank the staff respectively for the two centres who have worked very well to bring it and put it on together? And my final word is enjoy the refreshments, and may there be more of these events. Thank you very much for coming, and good night.